genitas, meam medet rudit simplicitas.
Hi, I'm Chris,
And I'm Elam.
and this is
Infobores,
the show where we have the sputterings and I can't think of the word, arguments against two opposing people and opinions.
We engage in dialectic.
Thank you.
Hegelians, come in. We have the goods.
Yeah, I had that planned all before we started, Elam. I was going to say something like sputterings and...
Spatterings?
Maybe it was spattering and that was it. Thanks. No, sputterings and mutterings. No, it was going to be very clever and witty, and unfortunately now it's just nothing. Like the show. Our show is about nothing, isn't it?
I disagree. I think it's very philosophical, like Hegel and Kant.
Okay, so we're going to talk in this show about things that are interesting and things that aren't.
Are very uninteresting.
Yeah, exactly. And we're also going to talk about things that might be a little upsetting to people, like today's topic.
I know that this topic in particular, which I'll name in a second, is upsetting, but it's also one I hold near and dear to my heart, surprisingly, and hence why I wanted to talk about it. So,
well, wait, before you get into that, before you even introduce this topic, why would this topic be near and dear to your heart, Elam?
So I think it's actually a bit difficult to talk about without divulging the topic, but it's something to do with a change in my own personal thinking. So the topic today, dear listener...
That's concerning. It's very concerning. Okay, go ahead.
See.
Sorry.
So, dear listener, and please forgive the profanity, but today we're talking about a piece titled Immersion, open parentheses, Piss Christ, by Serrano Andre.
Well, you got that absolutely correct. I'm very impressed because, frankly, I did not know the piece well. I remember when it came out into the public back in 1987, I think it was. It made headlines around the Christian world, at least. And I'm very impressed that you knew not only the name, but also the name of the artist.
Well, it's a piece I actually quite appreciate. So I guess we can... for some historical context, I guess, on why this piece is important, and I recommend, dear listener, you look it up for yourselves. We won't get into the history that much, but essentially... this piece was released and shown, and it turned out that the artist who made it had funding from the National Endowment of the Arts.
Well, that was part of the controversy, wasn't it? That
exactly.
That federal money was going to supplement this guy who made this, what some people thought was heretical or blasphemous.
And people looked at this piece and they said it wasn't art or it was blasphemous, it was needlessly offensive, stuff like that, and it caused a massive controversy, particularly around the idea of whether or not the government should endow the arts.
Well, then maybe you should go ahead and describe it then.
So the piece is, and this is one of the components that's really interesting, is talking about what the piece is. So what Serrano had done, or the artist Andre had done, was he... And there's no clean way of phrasing this, of course. He put a crucifix into presumably a jar of some sort and proceeded to fill that jar with urine.
His own urine, I understand.
His own urine, yes.
That makes a difference, I guess.
It kind of does. And the final piece, though, is not the jar. It's not like they would show this jar in the museums. Instead, it's specifically the image you will see if you look up Piss Christ. Which is this image of the crucifix within the jar, and it's a close-up, so you can't really identify what the liquid is.
Yeah, that was interesting. Like when I first saw this, I thought it could have been epoxy or something like that.
Amber, too. Lots of options as to what it could be.
But now I know it's rather disturbing, I have to admit.
Well, disturbing. So, I'm pro this piece. I'm a fan of this piece, but I understand, and you were hesitant to make this the topic of our first discussion, but I understand that you do not enjoy this piece. And I was wondering if you could talk about your rationale why.
I actually am morphing in my opinion, and that's really embarrassing because as a evangelical conservative, I I struggle with the idea that I might actually find this thing to have some artistic value. But when I first engaged with it, I assumed just offhand that it would be blasphemous or heretical. The artist, as I read about it, said he did not intend for it to be blasphemous. He claims to be a devout Roman Catholic. The idea of the image of Christ being placed in urine is actually kind of an interesting idea because urine is our waste products. It is a very human thing. It reminds me a little bit. There was a philosopher who said, I'll say it more less crudely than he did, but he said once that all humans are gods who poop. That was what he said, like I said, a little differently said. But the idea is that we defecate, we pee, we do things like this. And in his incarnation, Christ did actually take on full humanity. The idea, too, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, now please don't hold me to this because I don't know this piece well, is that the artist was trying to get at this concept of crucifixion as a visceral event, as something that physically was horrific, including even urination and defecation.
So, funnily enough, dear listener, I feel like the conversation might have just been severely cut down.
Oh, no.
Because,
sorry.
Because my father has just now described essentially everything.
You didn't have to tell everybody I was your father.
Oh, whatever. But what I was basically going to describe the same thing. Now, what's interesting is I actually had the same exact first reaction, which is I had read about this piece in a book. I thought this seemed to me, and I have a lot of leeway to controversial art usually, but when I heard of this idea, I thought, oh, it's pointless and crass and stuff. But then, and I had this position for a while, but then, months later, I actually looked up the piece, and I saw the image, and the image was moving, because the close-up of it, and the way that the light plays with the cross...
It is rather overexposed, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the overexposure, the saturation on the image. It gives it a sanctified feel. It doesn't feel like a blasphemous piece. It feels like something shockingly genuine, and I think... if there is obscenity in it, it's the obscenity of how something can be so genuine within such a context.
Yeah, and I found the colorization interesting too. You don't have this image in front of you if you're listening to this, of course, but it's kind of an orangey red. Would you describe it?
Yeah.
And of course, that evokes ideas of blood and suffering and anger typically.
And the artist has another piece predating this one, I believe, called. I think Blood Cross, in which it's a cross made of, it's a photo of a cross made of congealed blood. And it's very much the same sort of concept, is this exploration of what it means for a deity, for the divine to become physical, to be able to be touched and stuff like that. Which is also interesting because this is actually part of a sort of ongoing trend since the 20th century, of Catholic artists.
Well, let me ask you something, Elam. There's in this picture, I see there's a bunch of bubbles captured. It's not that perfect photo that some people might try to get without any imperfections. This one looks marred and with modeled sides and images. Why is that, do you think?
I think the bubbles, the significance of the bubbles to me seemingly is still emphasizing the material fact of it. Like, you look at the tile and then you look at the image, and it still tracks. The bubbles make clear what the image consists of, but also at the same time doesn't deny what the image is connotatively delivering to you via its other components. It serves to emphasize the material reality without denying the spiritual sort of reality behind the image.
Well, let's talk for a second about the reception this picture got. By the way, it never was, as you said, it was never displayed in a jar or anything like that. It was always just prints of this photo. If you had not been told that this was urine, you would never have known. There was no way to know. So really it was the naming process that brought out that element. But this has been roundly condemned over the years by evangelicals. Can you guess why that would be? I mean, we both could probably guess, but I mean, you go for it.
Well, I think a lot of people, I think it's a mixture of the concept behind the piece, the idea of someone, urinating on the crucifix with the idea of it being like a disrespectful act. And then you add on to that the title, which includes a piece of profanity. I think that combination led a lot of people to start making that assumption. It also helps that this was part of an ongoing sort of campaign against the National Endowment, commonly regarded as providing money to degenerate people and stuff like that.
Well, I'm sure we'll get to that. We'll get to that. We have our own opinions on that. But I do have to admit, when you said that about the name, I thought, yeah, that's really true. Because when I first came into contact with this, the first contact I had was with the title. So Piss and Christ put together, and it was taking the thing that I consider most important, Christ, and the most earthy, uncouth, whatever, and putting them together. So yeah, I think that might have been the first jarring moment.
Yeah, and you were super hesitant, as I said previously, to actually have this be the topic for today's
Yeah,
discussion.
well, I did not like the idea, honestly.
Because you and I had talked to you about this piece before, and each time you were very against the piece. But now that you've looked more into it, it's interesting because you seemingly appreciate it a bit more.
Well, now I'm wondering, are we going to put this as the episode title, though? The examination of the piss and Christ?
We could probably use synonyms.
Yeah, but okay. I did see that at some point one of the prints here was exhibited at the Louvre. And it was torn down by religious protesters. Does that surprise you at all?
No, not really. There's a lot of history of modern art being targeted by people who don't think it deserves a space within the public conscious.
But it's not just modern art. I mean, it's.
Oh yeah.
It was about the religious connotations here.
Oh, you'd be surprised though, because there's examples. The painter's name is gonna not be present in my mind, unfortunately. But there's a painter who has this, in my opinion, really remarkable painting where it's just a stripe along flat colors.
Oh, does his name start with an R?
I don't know why.
Well, okay, never mind. Go on.
Well, the painter, his work was actually cut up by someone who hated the idea of it. It was sliced through, and they had to reconstruct it, and they weren't able to. And I think stories like that, and there's other stories of that type, shows that a lot of people will look at pieces like this one, just in terms of concept alone, and say, this doesn't deserve a spot in the public conscious, which we could discuss why that might be.
Well, I don't want to go down too far down that line, but it does remind me of something interesting I read from Francis Schaeffer once. He talked about the line of despair, and he particularly taught us about art pieces and postmodernism, and he was actually kind of ahead of his time in all that. But one thing he observed is that the use of titles was a way of redirecting the image's impact. And he thought somehow, and please, if you all are listening, you think, wow, he's got that all wrong. I admit, maybe I do. But of redirecting the viewer's attentions to something that really wasn't implicit in the image itself. Does that ring any bells for you?
Oh, yeah, and I think that's true with a lot of art. Like, I'll be reading poems sometimes, and sometimes when I'm reading a poetry collection, I might accidentally miss the title, because sometimes the title doesn't seemingly add much on a first glimpse. So I'll read past the title, read the poem, and then the title will turn out to be Perspective of a Murderer or something like that, and the poem will just be a description of a dog kicking around or something.
Speaking of a dog, I hear our dog in the background, yeah. So what you're saying is that you'll have, if you had that poem without any title, you might have viewed it and thought of it in one way, with one paradigm, but then having the title recast your whole direction.
Yeah, it's actually a big problem sometimes, because if you're writing and or making anything really, and you're just writing your thoughts out and stuff like that, and you finish the piece you're working on, but you don't have a title, well, you might have to come up with a title out of the blue. I've had this experience before where I gave a poem a title, and it resulted in the piece getting read completely differently than I had any intention of it doing, which is fine. Obviously, titles are important, and I've learned my lesson since.
Yes, that's why I want you to call me father. No, just kidding. Back to the image for just a minute. You know, what do you make of the fact that this is specifically a crucifix? It's not a cross. It is a crucifix.
I think the crucifix, there's two things to it. One, I think it is important for it to specifically be an image of Jesus Christ. I think if it was just a cross, it wouldn't have as much importance.
Okay, that's fair enough. I could see that.
Because it's about the materiality of Jesus.
But,
the second thing would
go
be,
on, sorry.
I think the crucifix is important just in terms of the artist's identity as a Roman Catholic.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. There's something distinctly Roman Catholic about this crucifix that he chose. First of all, there's a couple of things that are strange to me as I'm looking at the picture. This is a romanticized image of crucifixion. There is no way that the figure on this particular cross is undergoing the brutality of a Roman crucifixion.